The reality of Tamar, daughter of King David, who had her life torn apart by a brutal crime.
Imagine living within a powerful family, surrounded by riches and privileges, but also by intrigues, betrayals and a fate marked by pain. This was the reality of Tamar, daughter of King David, who had his life shattered by a brutal crime and a succession of tragedies that shaken the kingdom of Israel. Many people know David as the victorious king, man according to God's heart, but few deepen in the internal dramas that corroded his family. Tamar was a victim of lust and deception, but his story doesn't end in her. What came later was a sequence of events that involved manipulation, revenge, rebellion and even civil war. The question that remains is how far can omission and lack of justice turn a home into a battlefield? If you think the Bible is just a sacred storybook, get ready to find out an account that could be in any epic drama script. Today, let's dive into Tamar's tragic destination and understand how this story carries deep lessons about honor, forgiveness, and leadership. King David was not only a brilliant military leader, but also the patriarch of a family full of strategic alliances and complicated relationships. His many marriages have created a network of children with different origins and interests, which inevitably generated internal conflicts. Among these unions, Maacah stands out, a foreign princess who brought with her political ties, but also unexpected challenges to the royal family. From this union were born Absalom and Tamar, two brothers who shared a strong connection and a tragic destination. Absalom was admired for his beauty and charisma, characteristics that he would once use to challenge his own father. Tamar, known for his purity and sweetness, would have his life marked by an act of violence that would change everything. And it was precisely this family complexity that prepared the ground for a succession of events that would culminate in betrayal, revenge, and even civil war. David's sons grew surrounded by the weight of the throne and the consequences of his father's political decisions. David's love for his children was undeniable, but his difficulty in managing internal tensions had a high cost. What began as small rivalries soon became a whirlwind of lust, manipulation, and conflicts that would leave deep scars in the kingdom of Israel. Tamar was a young woman of rare beauty and purity, admired for her grace and dignity within the royal family. As the daughter of King David and sister of Absalom, she grew up surrounded by the luxury of the palace, but also by the complexities of the court. Unfortunately, your life did not follow the path of fairy tales. What should be a protected and honorable existence became a nightmare when her Amnon half-brother developed an unhealthy obsession. Amnon's desire was not love, but an uncontrolled lust that consumed him to the point of making him sick. Tamar, innocent and without suspecting his brother's wicked intentions, followed his routine without imagining that he was the target of a cruel plan. Within the royal family, alliances and interests often spoke louder than justice, and this environment of permissiveness would give Amnon the courage to act without fear of consequences. Tamar's fate was about to be marked by violence and injustice. The tragedy that was slaughtered about Tamar was not just a crime against her, but against the whole structure of the royal family. What happened on that fateful day could not be erased, and the scars of this brutal act would echo for generations. Its history makes us reflect on the dangers of impunity and omission in the face of injustice. How would King David himself deal with this situation? Silence and lack of action would only feed a spiral of pain and revenge. Amnon's mind was taken by sickly desire, but he knew he could not simply act without a plan. It was then that Jonadab, his cunning cousin and manipulator, suggested a devilish stratagem pretending to be sick to attract Tamar to his room. Thus, under the pretext of needing care, he caused his father, King David, ordered Tamar to go to him, without suspecting the danger his daughter ran. Tamar, in his kindness and innocence, complied with his brother's request without question. She entered Amnon's room believing she was there to help, without imagining that he had prepared a trap. When she realized her intentions, she tried to resist in every way, pleading so that he would not commit such atrocity. He argued that such an act would bring shame not only to her, but to him too. But Amnon's heart was hardened by lust, and he ignored his appeals. This tragic moment was the apex of deception and manipulation, proving how perversity can hide under masks of innocence and fragility. Amnon took advantage of Tamar's confidence and the power structure of the royal family to satisfy his selfish desire. What he did not expect was that this act sowed a storm of consequences, arousing Absalom's wrath and bringing a conflict that would shake the entire nation of Israel. After the terrible act, Amnon, who once said he was in love with Tamar, completely changed his attitude. His desire turned into revulsion, and he expelled her from his presence in a cruel and humiliating way. For Tamar, this was another stab in his dignity, because besides being raped, it was now treated as something disposable. She pleaded so that he would not abandon her that way, for it would further aggravate his shame, but Amnon did not want to hear. In society of the time, a woman's honor was directly linked to her purity, and such an event not only destroyed her chances of marriage, but also her position in the family and the community. Tamar tore his robes, put ashes over his head and cried bitterly, because he knew that his life would never be the same. She sought refuge at her brother Absalom's house, who, seeing her in that state, immediately understood what had happened. King David was furious to learn of what happened, but surprisingly, did not take any attitude against Amnon. This silence was an even greater blow to Tamar and Absalom, who expected a firm response from his father. The king's omission not only wounded his daughter even more, but also planted the seed of the revolt in Absalom's heart. If justice did not come through the king, he would have to act himself. And so a new chapter of betrayal and revenge began to draw. Absalom was not a man who easily forgot an injustice, especially when this injustice fell on his own sister. Since the day Tamar came to his home, humiliated and broken, he kept silence, but in his heart the desire for revenge grew. He waited for David to take some attitude against Amnon, but when he realized that nothing would happen, he decided that he would do justice himself. However, Absalom was patient and strategic, would not act on impulse, but at the right time. For 2 years, Absalom hid his grudge on a normality appearance. He maintained coexistence with Amnon, without showing his intentions, until the perfect time has arrived to execute his plan. He organized a great party for the king's children, and when Amnon was already drunk and vulnerable, he ordered his servants to kill him. The crime was committed before everyone, and thus Tamar's revenge was finally performed. But the price of this personal justice would be high. Amnon's murder not only shook the royal family, but also the kingdom itself. The news spread quickly, and David, upon learning, was devastated. Once again, he saw one of his children being destroyed by the shadow of violence and deception. Absalom, in turn, knew he could not remain in Jerusalem after such an act and fled not to face his father's wrath. But this escape was just the beginning of a new cycle of conflict within David's family. After murdering Amnon, Absalom knew that his position in the royal family was threatened. Without waiting for the king's judgment, he fled to the land of Gezer, where he lived under the protection of his maternal grandfather, King Talmai. For 3 years, he remained far from Jerusalem, while David, even hurt, felt the absence of his son. Absalom's exile was not only an escape from justice, but also an emotional removal that further increased tension within the royal family. Despite the pain he felt, David took no initiative to bring his son back. His heart was divided between the need for discipline and the paternal love that still nourished by Absalom. Joab, commander of the army and counselor of the king, realized that this situation could not drag itself forever. Using an ingenious strategy, David convinced to allow the return of Absalom, thus restoring part of harmony in the palace, or at least that was what was expected. When Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem, he realized that his return did not mean reconciliation. For 2 years, he remained in town without being received by his father, which only increased his frustration. He wanted not only to go home, but recover his status and influence. The hurt that nourished David grew, and instead of seeking peace, he began to plan something much greater: the rebellion against the king himself. Absalom was not just a prince, he was charismatic, strategist, and knew how to conquer the people. Feeling rejected by his own father, he slowly began to undermine David's authority. He was strategically positioned at the city gates, listening to the complaints of the people and offering solutions that David seemed unable to give. With sweet words and seductive promises, he gained the sympathy of many Israelites, until finally declared himself king in Hebron, openly challenging his father's government. The blow was fast and efficient. Absalom got enough support to force David to flee from Jerusalem, leaving the throne temporarily in the hands of his rebellious son. The king, who had already faced battles against enemy giants and nations, now needed to fight his own blood. But Absalom didn't just want the throne. "I would humiliate David and consolidate his domain." In a symbolic and provocative act, he took the king's concubines to publicly demonstrate that his ascension was irreversible. The tension in Israel has reached its apex. The kingdom was divided, and a civil war became inevitable. On the one hand, the legitimate, weakened but still with faithful allies. On the other, a young prince determined to gain power at any cost. What began as a desire for justice for Tamar now became a battle that would decide the future of the nation. But Absalom, despite his charisma, did not imagine that his fate was about to take an unexpected course. The war between David and Absalom finally arrived at the battlefield. The king, despite the pain of fighting his own son, organized his army with strategy and experience. Already Absalom, driven by ambition, trusted more in his charisma than in military ability. When the confrontation began, it was clear that David still had the strength of a warrior leader, and Absalom's troops soon turned to a disadvantage. What seemed to be a certain victory for the prince began to become a disaster. During the escape, Absalom found an end as dramatic as his life. While desperately riding a dense forest, her long hair became stuck in the branches of a tree. His horse moved on, leaving him suspended and helpless. It was there that Joab, the commander of the army of David, ignoring any order of mercy, took the opportunity and ordered its execution. The prince who once dreamed of reigning over Israel now lies dead, hanging between heaven and earth. Absalom's death was not only the end of his rebellion, but a cruel reminder of the consequences of revenge and united ambition. He began his journey seeking justice to Tamar, but on the way he was lost in the desire for power. In the end, not only failed to take the throne, but also caused pain and destruction within his own family. Its story proves that lack of forgiveness and the desire for control can lead even the most beloved to failure. When David received the news of Absalom's death, his reaction was not of relief or victory, but of deep pain. The king, who had fled from Jerusalem to save his life, now cried for his son who tried to destroy him. "Absalom, my son! I wish I had died in your place." It was the words that echoed through the corridors of the palace. It was the regret of a father who, despite all the betrayals, still loved his son unconditionally. The soldiers and officers expected a celebration for victory, but found a king broken by sadness. Joab himself had to rebuke him, reminding him that his excessive pain unmotivated those who had fought for him. However, David's pain went beyond the loss of Absalom. It was the weight of guilt, repentance, and awareness that errors inside his house had led to this tragedy. The king, who has so often overcome external enemies, failed to prevent his own family from destroying himself. David's mourning was not only for his rebel son, but for the entire sequence of events that began with Tamar's suffering. Its history teaches us that omission in the face of injustice has devastating consequences. If he had acted firmly against Amnon, perhaps all this tragedy had been avoided. In the end, it was not just Absalom that died, it was hope for a family that could have been different. The story of Tamar, Amnon and Absalom is more than a family drama, it is a mirror of the consequences of poorly made decisions and omission in the face of injustice. Amnon's uncontrolled lust led to ruin not only his own life, but also that of his sister and brother. David's silence in the face of Tamar's suffering planted the seed of revenge on Absalom's heart. And the search for justice made by their own hands eventually led the kingdom to the civil war and mourning. This account teaches us that leadership requires the courage to face conflicts, especially at home. David was a great king, but failed as a father as he avoided making difficult decisions. How many times, in our own lives, do we ignore problems hoping to solve alone? Tamar needed protection and justice, Absalom needed discipline and direction, and Amnon needed consequences for his actions. However, without firm leadership, the family fragmented. There is also a lesson on forgiveness and reconciliation. If Absalom had sought justice in the right way, perhaps his story had been different. If David had been more present and assertive, he might have avoided so many tragedies. These reflections are an invitation to look at our own lives and realize how we are dealing with the challenges around us. After all, how many personal kingdoms have been destroyed by lack of action? The story of Tamar, Amnon and Absalom is not just an old account, it is a warning about how omission, lack of justice, and thirst for revenge can lead to destruction. Within David's family, which began with an act of lust and injustice, grew until it became a rebellion and a civil war. How many times in our lives do we ignore small conflicts until they become too big to be controlled? This narrative invites us to reflect: how do we deal with the injustices around us? When we see something wrong, do we have the courage to act or prefer silence, like David? And when we are injured, do we seek to solve it correctly or let bitterness consume us, like Absalom? These are powerful questions that help us grow and make us better leaders, whether in our families, communities, or any area of life. If this content has brought important reflections for you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Here we explore deep Bible stories and extract practical lessons for our daily lives. Leave your comment on what has impacted you most in this story and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. We see each other in the next video.